Hello and welcome to lecture 10 of the syntax lectures. This week we're going to be looking at what goes above the VP but between the verb and the inflection. This part of the structure of the clause contains a number of elements, mainly the auxiliary verbs, the non-modal auxiliary verbs, that's have, be and do, and also negative elements like the particle not. Let's first of all have a few words about the non-modal auxiliary verbs. Note we see them here inside the clause. They follow the inflection, the modal auxiliary, but precede the verb. And we have here be and have that work like this. Clearly these are not the same thing as the modals, they're not in complementary distribution with the modals at all, and in fact they're not in complementary distribution with each other because you can have them both as well. So in that last sentence, John may have been running, you've got the have and the be there. Now, typically it's assumed that these auxiliaries form part of the verb phrase. So they come inside the verb phrase, and one straightforward reason to believe that is that we know that inflections always have VP complements, and given that the non-modal auxiliaries are to the right of the inflectional element, presumably they are inside that VP complement. There is empirical reason to believe that this is so as well. For example, the word so is often assumed to be a pro form of a verb phrase. So in a sentence like John may leave and so may you, the so stands for leave. Okay, so leave is the verb phrase, so is like a pro VP. And therefore, presumably, it has the status of a verb phrase. Now, consider the following sentences. John might be leaving, and so might Mary, where so stands for be leaving. So be leaving is a verb phrase. But in the same way, we can have something like, I thought John might be leaving, and so he might have. I thought John might leave, and so he might have. Where the so seems to be standing just for the verb left, or the VP left, and that excludes the auxiliary verb have. So in this case we can see that left is a verb phrase. Now those two things together then suggest that what's going on is that these non-modal auxiliary verbs actually head their own verb phrase, and inside that we have another verb phrase. So we've got a structure that looks like this. John may have left. John is the argument of the thematic verb, that is left in this case. Have, note, is not a thematic verb. It doesn't have any arguments at all, but it heads a verb phrase on top of the thematic verb phrase. John then will move out of the lower VP into the subject position, and we'll get the relevant word order there. The same thing presumably is true of the be auxiliary verb. It is also the head of a verb phrase which takes a verb phrase, the thematic verb phrase, as its complement. And furthermore, if we get them stacked, then what we have is each auxiliary verb heads its own verb phrase and takes a verb phrase as its complement. So here we've got have been leaving, with John starting off. It's the lowest thematic verb phrase headed by the verb to leave, and have takes the VP, been leaving, as its complement, and be takes the VP, leaving, as its complement. So we seem to have a very regular syntax here. Each auxiliary verb adds an extra VP on top of the original thematic VP. Now, let's consider this word not. The not particle adds the meaning of negation in a sentence, And note where we find it is after the modal auxiliary, but we can get it in front of the other two auxiliaries. So John will not have been running. There we've got not in front of the whole VP. However, that's not the only place that we can find it. You can also find it between the two auxiliary verbs, as in will have not been running, and you can even find it after the two auxiliary verbs in front of the main verb, as in will have been not running but walking. Now all this suggests that where not sits in the sentence is in a position where it adjoins itself to the left of the verb phrase. And given that we've got a number of verb phrases here, we can see that it can adjoin itself to any of those VPs. The top one, where it appears in front of all of the verbal elements, not have been running, or the second one, where it will appear after the have and before the be, or the lowest one, where it'll appear just in front of the main verb. Now, there are places where you can't put the not, and this is you can't have it after the main verb, so you can't say John will have been running not, and you can't put it in front of the modal auxiliary verb. You can't say John not will have been running. Now that indicates two things. First thing, that you can't adjoin the not to the right side of the VP. Okay, so not has a strict left adjunction position. And the other thing is you can't adjoin not to anything else other than a VP. In order for it to get to the left of the modal auxiliary, it would have to be adjoined to the I bar. If it were adjoined to the IP, it would be right in front of the subject too, and you would get not John will have been running, which again is also not possible. So although there seems to be a fairly a free status of where you can place not, it actually has a rather limited distribution, in as much as it can only left adjoin to a verb phrase. Now, with that in mind, let's consider how the auxiliary verb do works. Well, we know that a sentence has an inflectional element. Here in this sentence, John may know, that is represented by a free morpheme, the modal auxiliary. However, we can also represent the inflection as a bound morpheme if it's a tense. And in that case, that bound morpheme needs to be bound by something, and what we do is we move the verb out of the verb phrase into the inflection position where the verb and the inflection get together, so that the verb attaches to the inflection and binds it. That's known as V to I movement. So we move the verb from the V position to the I position in order to support this bound morpheme. So this is our structure of the clause, where we've got the not adjoined to the VP, and when we've got the modal auxiliary verb there, nothing else needs to happen. The verb doesn't need to move to the inflection, because the inflection here is a free morpheme, not a bound morpheme. But if we were to replace the modal here with a bound tense morpheme, for example, what we would predict should happen here is that the verb is going to move out of the VP in order to support the inflection. However, surprisingly, that turns out to be an ungrammatical movement. You can't say John knows not with the verb moving out of the VP over the top of the not. For some reason or other, that's not allowed, and it appears that the reason it's not allowed has got something to do with the presence of the not. So whatever it is that prevents the verb from moving, we've obviously got to do something about it. And what we do is to make up a word that is going to act as something that can support the inflection, and that word is do. So instead of moving the verb to support the inflection, we insert this auxiliary verb do into that position to do that job. So in the end we end up with John does not know. The verb stays put inside the VP and the do is inserted there. Now note, the do is a meaningless thing here. It doesn't add any meaning to the sentence. This just means the same thing as it would have meant had the verb been able to move. But the do is there purely for grammatical reasons. So the analysis then of this sort of sentence has a couple of considerations. First of all, we have to argue that the V to I movement is blocked by the presence of the not, for whatever reason. And secondly, that a bound morpheme still has to be bound by something. And the conclusion from that, those two requirements, is that we've got to insert something in order to support the inflection, and the thing that we insert is going to obviously carry no meaning. It's there purely for a grammatical purpose, and that is exactly what this verb do is doing there. Therefore, we call an auxiliary like do a dummy auxiliary, in as much as it doesn't seem to be carrying any meaning at all, just performing a grammatical function. Now, with that in mind, let's turn to the other auxiliary verbs. Let's start off with the verb to be. Now, one place we use the verb to be is in cases where we have an adjectival phrase in the sentence. So something like John is tall. There we've got this verb be there. Now, if you consider the meaning of this sentence, you come to the conclusion that actually this verb be is doing very little in terms of the semantics of the sentence. The predicate of this sentence is in fact tall. That is what is predicated of John. John, but in this sentence, is associated with this notion of tallness. Okay, so John actually is the argument of the adjective, not of the verb to be. In fact, if you think about it, the verb to be doesn't actually perform very much of a semantic process at all there. We can see the fact that be is actually not absolutely necessary if we consider some other kinds of sentences. In this sentence, we've got a CP, that John is tall, as the complement of a verb like consider. I consider that John is tall, for example. But note, there's another way of saying more or less the same thing by missing out most of that sentence. So we could say, I consider John tall. Now, what's John tall? It doesn't seem to be a CP, an IP, or even any VP there, because there is no verb. All we have is the adjective tall and its argument John. What we seem to have, therefore, is just an AP, an adjectival phrase headed by tall with the subject inside that AP, presumably in the specifier position of the AP. This is often referred to as a small clause. That is something which has the meaning of a clause, but doesn't have anything that clauses syntactically require, that is, inflections and complementizers and verbs. If there is an inflection, there's got to be a verb because inflections take VP complements. Given that there's no verb here, we can assume therefore there's no inflection, and if there's no inflection there can be no complementizer either, because complementizers take IP complements. So all we have in this case is a small clause adjectival phrase. Okay, if we consider what's going on then in something like John is tall, we've got John starting off inside the lowest AP. We've got the inflection that needs to be bound by the verb, and we've got the verb heading a verb phrase. Of course, the question is, if we've got the verb there, why do we need it? Because it performs no semantic function. Okay. Well, it seems there are two reasons why we need the be in this case. We need the be because inflections must have a VP complement, and if we didn't have a verb there, the complement would just simply be the AP. and inflections can't take AP complements. The other reason in this particular sentence is, well, the inflection is a bound morpheme, and bound morphemes have to be bound. Inflections in particular need to be bound by verbs, so again we're going to need a verbal element. So it's as though this verb is inserted into this structure to perform these syntactic functions, not a semantic one. And in that case then, be is very much like do. We've seen that do is inserted into a structure for grammatical purposes, not semantic purposes. That seems to be exactly what's going on with be. So perhaps we could argue that do isn't the only dummy auxiliary that English makes use of, but be is also like that. We can see that the auxiliary verb be does behave like a dummy auxiliary if we consider its function as a pure auxiliary verb. That is when it accompanies a verb like running. Now in this sentence what we have is the verb run is heading a verb phrase where the argument is John, the one who's doing the running, starting off inside that VP and then moves up to the subject position. We've got a bound morpheme in the inflection position, and then the be presumably is there to support that inflection. Again, it doesn't seem as though it's doing anything semantically. But note, in this case, the verb, run is a verb heading a VP. And therefore, if we didn't even have the VP for the be there, the sentence would still be presumably possible because inflections need VPs as complements, and this time we don't have just an AP predicate, we've got a VP predicate. So the question arises, do we actually need that verb phrase headed by the verb to be? Well, there's reasons to believe that we don't. Consider something like this. I saw John run. This is very similar to the causative construction that we saw several weeks ago, where a perception verb like to see, can take something like a clause which contains just the verb and its arguments. There's no inflection here, there's no complementizer here. So what we have here is this verb phrase with a subject. That's what we call the small clause. But note, this small clause can also involve not just a verb, but a continuous verb like running. So I saw John running is perfectly good too. And note, in this case, we've just got the verb phrase and we've got the ing form, but we don't have any inflection. We don't have any verb to be. And presumably the reason why we don't have the verb to be here is because we don't have an inflection for the verb to be to support. In other words, when there's no need to have the verb to be, you just don't have it at all. And that would argue that that whole VP that we've got in this structure here is actually unnecessary. Presumably, therefore, what's actually going on here is that we've got our VP John running and the inflection, and for some reason or other, which we'll talk about later, the verb doesn't support this inflection, but just like we do with the dummy auxiliary, when the verb can't support the inflection, we insert a dummy verb, this time the verb to be, directly into the inflection position, and we don't apparently need to have the VP headed by be in this structure at all. The same thing can actually be argued for the auxiliary verb have as well. This is the structure that we presume we might have here. Again, we've got a thematic verb, the verb to go, with its argument heading inside the VP. John is then going to move into the subject position, just like all other subjects do. Have is supporting the bound intense inflection, and presumably heads a verb phrase. Again, the question is, do we really need to have that VP there, given that we already have a VP headed by the verb to go? And again, there is evidence to suggest that when there's no inflection, we don't need the auxiliary verb. This time, it comes from a kind of construction that's sometimes referred to as a mad-mag sentence. These are special kinds of sentences where we appear to have just a subject and a predicate without any of the inflections and complementizers, and presumably, therefore, these are also small clauses. The example here is John gone. I can't believe it. And it's the John gone part, which appears to be a small clause note. All it consists of here is the subject plus the verb in its perfect form. But note, we don't have an auxiliary verb there, so apparently when there's no inflection, we don't need the auxiliary verb. And presumably, therefore, that VP headed by this auxiliary verb isn't actually necessary. The only reason we have that auxiliary verb is to support the inflection. So again, then what we can assume is going on here is that the inflection takes a VP headed by the thematic verb with its argument inside it, and then we need to support that inflection by inserting an auxiliary verb. So the auxiliary verb is like be and like do. It's a dummy auxiliary inserted into the structure to perform a grammatical function rather than any semantic function. Now, that raises a question, though. If the auxiliary verbs in these cases are meaningless dummies, where does the meaning of the aspectual elements come from? We've seen that all you need in sentences to get these aspectual interpretations is in fact the inflection, the ing or the n, which attaches to the verb. We don't need the auxiliary, so it doesn't seem as though it's the auxiliary which is adding these meanings. So what is the status of the aspectual morphemes that seem to be the carriers of these aspectual meanings? Well, we can perhaps see what's going on here if we consider a slightly more complicated example, one where we have both of the auxiliary verbs present. So in something like John has been hiding. Now, presumably what we've got here is the verb to hide is the thematic verb with the subject, with its argument inside that VP. That's going to move into the subject position, just as the subjects normally do. We've got the inflection, a bound tense morpheme, that's being supported here by have. But note, between them, we've got the be and the morpheme un. Now, why is the auxiliary verb be here? It seems that its function is to support the un, but note, if that's what's going on, that un morpheme, the perfect morpheme, seems to be completely independent. It has a life of its own, as it were, and just like the tense morpheme then, it seems as though that's the thing that is present in the structure. So before anything gets inserted to support these morphemes, what we have is the un is some sort of head inside the structure. Now note, the thing is, it has to be treated as a verbal element for the reason that inflections always have VP complements. So whatever this un is, clearly it's not a thematic verb, but some sort of functional verbal element heading a VP, which can therefore act as the complement of the inflection. Being a bound morpheme, it needs supporting, and again, for some reason, which we'll talk about slightly later, the verb isn't able to support the un, so we need to insert the auxiliary verbs in order to support these bound morphemes. And what we do is we insert both the have and the be to support the tense and the un. Now, if that's true of the un morpheme, And presumably exactly the same thing is going to be true of the ing morpheme too, that is, the progressive ing as well as the perfect n. So in this structure where we've got John has been hiding, what we actually have is both the n and the ing are separate inflectional elements, heading their own separate VPs, just like the tense is a bound morpheme heading a phrase. Also, two of these aspectual elements. The difference between them is a categorial one. Tense is an inflectional element, whereas n and ing are both verbal elements. The main verb then is hide, and that starts off inside the lowest thematic VP with its argument. The argument is going to move to subject position as always. Now, what apparently happens in this case, however, is that we've got now three bound morphemes that need to be bound. The lowest one, the ing, is what the verb supports, and presumably it does that in the same way that we've seen verbs support other morphemes. That is, they start off inside the verb phrase, but they move out of the verb phrase to support this bound morpheme. Now that in itself gives us an indication of why the verb can't support any other of these morphemes, and that is, well, there seems to be a restriction in English that English stems can only support one inflectional morpheme. So given that the verb moves and sticks itself onto the ing, and all movements have to be short, remember, therefore the verb will stick itself onto the lowest of these inflectional morphemes, and that will leave the other two left over needing support, and that's precisely where we insert these auxiliary verbs. We're going to insert the be to support the n morpheme, and we're going to insert the have to support the tense morpheme, and we'll end up with John has been hiding. Okay, so let's summarize today's lecture then. We've argued that this negative particle not left adjoins to verb phrases, and therefore it has a reasonably varied distribution depending on how many verb phrases we have. Each verb phrase headed either by the main verb or one of these aspectual morphemes then will provide a place for the not to be adjoined to. When it's present, it's going to prevent the verb from moving over the top of it, and therefore verbs can't move into the inflection position in the presence of this element. Instead, what we have to do in that case is insert a dummy auxiliary, and the auxiliary that we insert in that instance is the auxiliary do. Now, we've also argued that the auxiliary verbs have and be are also dummy auxiliaries, that is, auxiliaries inserted into a structure to support a bound morpheme rather than to add any semantic content. The semantic content is what the morphemes are adding, not the auxiliary verbs. So each of these auxiliaries are inserted to support bound morphemes when either there's no verb in order to do that, or the verb can't do it for whatever reason. So when we've just got an adjectival predicate, no verb, then obviously we need the verb to be inserted into that structure, and when the verb is already supporting a bound morpheme, then it can't support any more, and that's exactly when we need to insert another auxiliary to do that job for us. Finally, the aspectual morphemes themselves are verbal heads which introduce the aspectual meanings of continuousness and perfectness. They're bound morphemes, just like tense is, and therefore they need to be supported in some way or other. When the verb can do so, the verb will move and support these aspectual morphemes, but it can only support one of them, and the one that it supports is going to be the lowest in the structure. So it'll either attach to ing if it's present, or it'll attach to n if it's present, or it'll attach to the tense if neither ing or n are present. The dummy auxiliaries then are inserted to support any remaining bound morphemes. So if there's an and a tense, the verb will move to the and the tense will have to be supported by the auxiliary verb. If there's both an ing, and a tense, then the verb will move to support the ing, and both the and the tense are going to need supporting by an inserted auxiliary. Okay, that's enough for this week, and I'll see you next week. Bye bye.